Picture this. It's 873 AD, and your brother Aldrich, a respected monastery scribe in northeastern England. The morning bells have just finished calling your brothers to prayer when different bells start ringing. The warning bells that make your blood freeze. You set down your quill, still wet with ink from copying scripture, and peer through the narrow window of your scriptorium. Through the coastal mist, you see them, long ships cutting through the gray waters like death itself approaching shore. Their dragon heads rise and fall with each wave, and you can make out the glint of weapons and shields along their sides. Your first thought is, relief. These are just raiders coming for the monastery's gold and silver. You've heard the stories. They'll take what they can carry and leave. You clutch your crucifix and whisper a prayer, thinking they'll demand treasure and be gone by sunset. But what you don't realize, what no Christian chronicler wants to write down in full, is that what they really want isn't in your treasury. What they want is you, your novices, the village girls who come to morning prayers, the children playing in the courtyard. They're not here just to steal. They're here to harvest human beings like crops, to drag them back to a society where people are bred like livestock, where children grow up knowing they exist only to satisfy their owner's every desire, where death itself becomes performance art, designed to honor pagan gods through the systematic torture of the innocent. You think you know about Vikings? The History Channel has sold you sanitized heroes, noble warriors fighting for honor and glory, bearded explorers discovering new lands, complex characters struggling with fate and family. Hollywood Vikings brood handsomely about destiny, while rowing majestically through fjords bathed in golden light. But the real Vikings practiced traditions so dark that medieval Christian chroniclers, men who regularly witnessed public executions, torture, and warfare, refused to describe them fully. They called these practices unspeakable even by the brutal standards of their time, using phrases like abominations that offend God and nature, and deeds too wicked for Christian ears. For 3 centuries, Viking society operated systems of human exploitation that make modern trafficking look primitive by comparison. They didn't just raid for treasure and glory. They built an entire civilization on practices that turned human suffering into religious observance, slavery into sacred duty, and murder into divine communion. Before diving into these historical accounts that historians have deliberately obscured from popular understanding, hit that like button if you're ready to learn what really happened in medieval Scandinavia. And comment below where you're watching from. It's incredible how we can explore these forgotten truths together across time and space, connected by our shared curiosity about the darkest chapters of human history. Today we're uncovering 6 Viking traditions that have been carefully hidden from popular understanding because they reveal systematic cruelty that defined Norse society for generations. These aren't Hollywood inventions or Christian propaganda. These accounts come from primary sources including Arabic diplomats who witnessed these practices firsthand, Irish chroniclers who recorded what they saw, and, most damning of all, the Vikings' own sagas, where they proudly described what they considered normal parts of their culture. The foundation of Viking prosperity wasn't just raiding and trading. It was a slave system called thraldom that reduced captured people to property with no rights whatsoever, including control over their own bodies. This wasn't temporary captivity or indentured servitude. This was generational human ownership that created a permanent underclass bred for exploitation. According to the Gragas law codes from medieval Iceland, legal documents written by the Vikings themselves, thralls couldn't own property, couldn't marry without permission, and had no legal protection from whatever their masters demanded. But what made Viking slavery particularly systematic was how it specifically targeted women and children for purposes that went far beyond labor. Imagine being that monastery scribe we met earlier, now in chains, watching your world disappear behind you as the longship cuts through dark waters. You're not going to a quick death in battle. You're going to a lifetime of serving every desire of people who consider you less than human. The Dublin slave market, established by Viking raiders in 841, became medieval Europe's largest human trafficking center. The Arabic merchant Ibn Rusta, writing from first-hand observation, described seeing thousands of enslaved Europeans sold to buyers across the known world. Prices were based on age, health, and what he delicately called physical attributes suitable for various services. But here's what reveals the true scope of this system. Archaeological evidence shows thralls comprised up to 40% of the population in major Viking settlements. These weren't temporary captives working off debt. These were permanent property passed down through generations like livestock, with children inheriting their parents' slave status automatically. The saga of the people of Laxardal casually mentions how the wealthy farmer Hoskuld bought a beautiful slave woman in Norway, brought her home to Iceland, and used her as a concubine while his wife managed the household. The saga treats this as unremarkable as buying cattle, revealing how completely normalized such arrangements had become. Female thralls were routinely assigned as concubines for their owners and their owners' guests. The sagas describe this as normal household management and hospitality. A wealthy Viking host would offer his guests food, drink, and access to his female slaves as standard entertainment. The women had no choice in the matter and received no consideration for their feelings or preferences. Take the case documented in Egil's saga, where the protagonist's grandfather keeps several female thralls specifically for this purpose. When guests arrive, these women are presented alongside the evening meal. The saga notes which ones are skilled in pleasing and which are fresh from recent capture, as if describing different types of wine. Children born to thrall mothers automatically became property, ensuring constant supply without requiring external raids. These children grew up in a world where they knew from birth that their bodies belonged to others. Archaeological evidence from thrall quarters shows overcrowded, deliberately uncomfortable living conditions designed to reinforce their inferior status while keeping them healthy enough to work and reproduce. Contemporary Irish chronicles describe Viking raiders systematically targeting monasteries and towns not primarily for wealth, but for inhabitants. The Annals of Ulster record raids where Vikings left behind gold and silver to make room on their ships for more captives. These weren't random attacks, but organized procurement operations designed to stock slave markets with specific types of human merchandise. The psychological conditioning used to control thralls reveals sophisticated understanding of human behavior. Slaves were deliberately separated from family members to prevent mutual support. They were given minimal privileges, slightly better food, marginally better clothing, to create dependency while being subjected to random punishment and reward cycles that destroyed hope of escape while maintaining basic compliance. The procurement methods became so systematic that Viking expeditions planned their logistics around human cargo. Ships were modified with specialized holding areas. Routes were planned to hit multiple population centers in single voyages. Markets coordinated demand for specific types of slaves, young women for concubinage, strong men for labor, children for training into specialized roles. But thraldom was just the economic foundation for even darker practices woven into the very fabric of Viking spiritual life. While popular culture portrays Viking magic as harmless nature, worship herbs and runes, and connection to ancient wisdom, Seidh was something far more disturbing. This was systematic exploitation of death and human remains for supernatural purposes that horrified even medieval observers accustomed to various forms of cruelty. The Ynglinga saga, written by Vikings themselves, describes Seidr practitioners as deriving their power through direct communion with corpses. But the methods required for such communication involved practices that contemporary Christians considered diabolic, handling decomposing bodies, consuming substances derived from human remains, and performing rituals that required fresh corpses. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts in ways that make them impossible to dismiss as Christian propaganda. Excavations at Oseberg and other major sites have uncovered ritual implements, including containers showing chemical evidence of human blood and bodily fluids, found specifically in the graves of women identified through burial goods as velvas or sorceresses. Picture attending a seether ceremony in a Viking community. You're led to a grove outside the settlement where a vulva has prepared her ritual space. The smell hits you first, decomposing flesh mixed with burning herbs. The sorceress sits surrounded by human bones arranged in precise patterns, some still bearing traces of rotted meat. She begins consuming what looks like raw organ meat while chanting in voices that seem to come from multiple throats. According to the saga of Eric the Red, Velva ceremonies required the hearts of recently sacrificed humans and animals. The ritual demanded that practitioners enter trance states through consumption of these organs while surrounded by bones of the dead, arranged in specific geometric patterns that supposedly opened doorways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. But what made Seithr particularly disturbing wasn't just the corpse handling. It was how completely these practices were integrated into normal community life. Velvas weren't isolated hermits practicing forbidden arts in secret. They were respected community members, consulted for everything from weather prediction to healing illnesses to settling legal disputes. Adam of Bremen, the German chronicler who interviewed Viking traders and travelers, documented sorcerers who claimed to raise the dead for divination purposes. These rituals supposedly allowed them to question deceased individuals about future events, but the process required practitioners to perform acts with corpses that horrified Christian witnesses, acts so disturbing that Adam wrote he could not set down in writing the full extent of their debasement. The training required to become a Velva reveals the systematic nature of these practices. Young women, selected for Seithr instruction, underwent years of conditioning that included deliberate exposure to death, decay, and human suffering. They were taught to overcome natural revulsion toward decomposing bodies and to derive what they claimed was spiritual energy from direct contact with the dead. Archaeological finds from vulva graves include sophisticated tools specifically designed for their practices, implements for extracting fluids from corpses, specialized knives for preparing human remains, and ornate containers that chemical analysis shows once held human blood and other bodily substances. These weren't crude implements, but finely crafted instruments that required considerable skill to manufacture and use effectively. Contemporary accounts describe Velvas displaying behavior that modern psychology would recognize as severe trauma symptoms, dissociation, emotional numbing, and what witnesses called speaking with the voices of the dead. Their claimed supernatural abilities may have actually resulted from psychological damage caused by repeated exposure to extreme ritualistic practices involving human remains. The social position of Velvas created additional disturbing dynamics. While they were feared and respected, they were also considered sexually dangerous and spiritually contaminated. Norse society viewed Seithr as fundamentally unmanly, which paradoxically made it more threatening when practiced by women who could access powers that even male warriors feared. But even these systematic death magic practices were overshadowed by the ritualized murder that formed the foundation of Viking religious observance. Viking blot ceremonies represent perhaps history's most systematic integration of human sacrifice into regular religious practice. While other cultures practiced occasional human offerings during crises, the Norse made murder an essential component of their ongoing relationship with the divine, creating annual cycles of ritualized killing that defined community life. Adam of Bremen's account of the Uppsala temple describes sacrifices conducted every 9 years, where 9 individuals of every species, including humans, were killed and hung from trees in the sacred grove. But archaeological evidence reveals this wasn't just periodic excess. Human sacrifice was woven into the seasonal rhythms of Viking society. Picture yourself living in a Viking community as winter approaches. The autumn harvest has been gathered, but everyone knows what comes next. Village elders begin walking through households, their eyes lingering on certain individuals, the elderly who've become burdens, the disabled who can't contribute to community defense, sometimes even healthy adults whose families have fallen out of political favor. The selection process for human sacrifices followed specific criteria that supposedly made victims more pleasing to particular gods. Young, healthy individuals were preferred for major ceremonies, but social status also determined who would be chosen for different types of sacrifice. Thralls were the most common victims, but free citizens could also be selected if circumstances demanded particularly valuable offerings. Archaeological evidence from Uppsala and other ritual sites confirms these accounts through mass burial sites containing hundreds of human remains showing evidence of ritualistic killing. The positioning of bodies, evidence of restraints, and analysis of bone trauma reveal systematic execution methods designed to prolong death while ensuring that victims remained conscious during the ritual process. At Tiso in Denmark, archaeologists uncovered a ritual site where over 200 human bones show evidence of deliberate dismemberment and processing. Cut marks on the bones indicate that bodies were systematically taken apart according to specific patterns, with certain organs and body parts reserved for different aspects of the ceremony. The methods used for conducting human sacrifices were specifically designed to honor different gods through different types of death. Odin, the god of war and death, received victims who were hanged from trees and left to die slowly while ravens gathered to feast on their eyes. Thor, the thunder god, received those killed by blunt force trauma that shattered skulls like his hammer crushing enemies. Freyr, the fertility god, received victims who were drowned in bogs or burned alive in massive pyres. Each method required specific preparations and procedures that maximized the victim's suffering while ensuring proper ritual observance. The hanging sacrifices to Odin involved positioning victims so they could watch each other die over the course of hours or days. The burning sacrifices to Frey required building elaborate wooden structures that would burn slowly enough to prolong the agony while creating impressive visual spectacles. The seasonal timing of these sacrifices created annual cycles of terror for Viking communities. Major sacrifices were conducted during winter solstice to ensure the sun's return, during spring planting to guarantee good harvests, and during autumn celebrations to thank the gods for their bounty. Smaller offerings occurred monthly or even weekly, maintaining constant demand for sacrificial victims. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate preparation processes for sacrificial victims that could last for days or weeks. Intended sacrifices were kept in special quarters within the temple complex, fed particular diets that supposedly made them more acceptable to the gods, and subjected to purification rituals that were actually systematic psychological torture designed to break their resistance before the actual killing occurred. Community participation in these ceremonies meant that entire populations were complicit in systematic murder. Archaeological evidence suggests that blot events drew hundreds of participants who played specific roles in the sacrificial process. From capturing and restraining victims to disposing of remains, according to ritual requirements that involved scattering body parts across sacred landscapes. Children were required to attend these ceremonies from an early age, conditioning them to view human sacrifice as normal religious practice. This generational indoctrination ensured that opposition to such practices was virtually unthinkable within Norse society. Young Vikings grew up understanding that taking human life for religious purposes was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining proper relationships with the gods. The economic implications of these practices created additional incentives for their continuation. Sacrificial ceremonies generated revenue through offerings from participants, tribute from subject communities who wanted to avoid being raided for victims, and the confiscation of sacrificial victims' property. The religious establishment that conducted these rituals became wealthy through systematic murder disguised as divine service. But even systematic human sacrifice was considered less disturbing than the elaborate abuse that accompanied Viking funeral practices. The most detailed and disturbing account of Viking funeral practices comes from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arabic diplomat who witnessed ceremonies among the Rus Vikings that revealed the complete intersection of death, social hierarchy, and systematic abuse that characterized Norse society at its darkest. According to Ibn Fadlan's eyewitness testimony, recorded in his travel account that survives in multiple manuscript traditions. The funeral of a Viking chieftain required the death of a female slave who would accompany her master to the afterlife. But this wasn't simple execution. It was elaborate, ritualistic abuse lasting several days and designed to demonstrate the absolute power that masters held over their human property, even in death. Imagine being that slave girl chosen for this honor. You're perhaps 16 years old, taken in a raid from some Irish monastery years ago, and you've served in this household long enough to understand exactly what's expected of you. When your master dies, his family gathers all the female slaves and asks who wants to accompany him to Valhalla. You know, this isn't really a choice. Those who volunteer receive better treatment in their final days. Those who refuse face immediate punishment and eventual selection anyway. So, you raise your hand, because the illusion of choosing your fate seems preferable to having it forced upon you. The preparation process lasted for days, during which Ibn Fadlan observed the chosen slave being repeatedly intoxicated with alcohol and various drugs, while being subjected to what he delicately described as ritualistic attention from the deceased chieftain's male followers. His account makes clear that this supposed honoring of the slave involved systematic assault disguised as religious ceremony. Ibn Fadlan describes watching the psychological conditioning designed to break the victim's resistance while maintaining the fiction of willing participation. The slave was told repeatedly that she was honored to serve her master in death, that she would be welcomed as a queen in the afterlife, while being subjected to treatment that demonstrated her complete powerlessness and objectification. The ritual progressed through specific stages over the course of a week. First, the slave was removed from normal duties and given fine clothing and jewelry that marked her as the chosen companion. Then began the daily ceremonies where she was required to drink special potions that kept her in a semi-conscious state, while community members took turns performing what Ibn Fadlan called preparations for her journey. Each day, the slave was brought to the dead chieftain's ship, where she was forced to participate in rituals that supposedly prepared her spirit for the afterlife. These involved reciting phrases in a language she didn't understand while being handled by men who claimed to be readying her soul for its divine transformation. The final ceremony, witnessed by Ibn Fadlan and described in clinical detail that reveals his horror despite his attempts at diplomatic objectivity, involved the systematic abuse of the heavily drugged slave by multiple participants, before her eventual death by strangulation combined with multiple stab wounds. The entire community was required to witness this process, which could last for hours as the victim was repeatedly revived and abused before finally being killed. What made this particularly disturbing was the religious justification that framed every aspect of the abuse. The violence wasn't presented as cruelty, but as necessary preparation for the slave's transformation into a divine companion. Every assault was described as sacred obligation, every moment of suffering as evidence of the god's acceptance of the offering. The integration of sexual violence into funeral rites demonstrates how completely Viking society had normalized the abuse of enslaved women. What Ibn Fadlan witnessed wasn't considered unusual or particularly cruel by Viking standards, but was simply standard procedure for honoring deceased leaders through the systematic degradation of their human property. Ibn Fadlan's account provides unique insight because as a Muslim diplomat, he was familiar with various forms of violence and social hierarchy, yet he was clearly traumatized by what he witnessed. His description includes details about his own physical reactions, nausea, inability to sleep, recurring nightmares, that suggest the ceremony's impact even on experienced observers. Archaeological evidence from Viking ship burials confirms that multiple individuals were regularly killed and buried with important leaders, suggesting that Ibn Fadlan's account describes typical rather than exceptional practices. Sites across Scandinavia show evidence of elaborate funeral murders, involving not just single slaves, but entire households of servants sacrificed to accompany their masters. The international reaction to these practices as recorded by other foreign observers, including Byzantine diplomats and German merchants, reveals how even medieval societies that practiced various forms of cruelty were horrified by the systematic nature of Viking funeral abuse. These ceremonies became legendary throughout the medieval world as examples of barbarity that exceeded normal bounds of human behavior. But even these elaborate funeral murders pale in comparison to the torture method that became the Vikings' most infamous contribution to human cruelty. The blood eagle represents the pinnacle of Viking torture innovation, a procedure so elaborate and horrific that it transcends simple execution to become performance art, using human suffering as its medium. While some historians debate whether this method was actually practiced or exists only in legendary accounts, the detailed descriptions in multiple independent sagas suggest familiarity with anatomical knowledge that could only come from actual experience. According to the Orkneyinga saga and Egil's saga, both written by people familiar with Viking culture, the blood eagle involved cutting through the victim's back along both sides of the spine, breaking the ribs away from the backbone, and pulling the lungs out through the wounds to create the appearance of bloody wings spread in flight. But what made this procedure particularly horrific was its duration and the deliberate techniques used to keep victims conscious throughout the entire process. Picture the most hated enemy of a Viking chieftain, perhaps a rival who killed his father, or a king who destroyed his homeland. Simple execution isn't enough. The offense demands something that will be remembered for generations, something that will make other enemies reconsider their opposition when they hear what happened to this particular foe. The technical knowledge required for performing the blood eagle demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human anatomy that could only have been acquired through extensive practice. The procedure required precise cuts that would expose internal organs without causing immediate death from blood loss, skillful bone breaking that would create the wing effect without destroying lung function entirely, and careful timing that would maximize suffering while creating the desired visual spectacle. Saga accounts describe the process beginning with the victim being secured face down on a wooden platform, with arms and legs bound to prevent movement that might interfere with the executioner's work. The initial cuts were made slowly and deliberately, following the curve of the ribs while avoiding major blood vessels that would cause rapid death. The breaking of the ribs required considerable physical strength and anatomical knowledge. Each rib had to be severed from the spine and bent outward without puncturing the lungs prematurely. The sound of breaking bone reportedly created a rhythmic cracking that could be heard throughout the gathered crowd, adding an auditory element to the visual horror. The final stage involved carefully extracting the lungs through the back wounds and positioning them to create the wing effect. This required the victim to remain conscious and breathing while their lungs were pulled outside their body, a feat that demanded precise knowledge of which tissues could be cut and which had to remain intact to preserve lifelong. Enough to complete the ritual, the religious significance of the blood eagle related to its dedication to Odin, the one-eyed god associated with death, war, and sacrifice. Victims were supposedly offered to Odin in this manner, to ensure victory in future battles or to achieve revenge against particularly hated enemies. The eagle imagery connected to Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, which were said to feast on battlefield corpses and carry information between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Saga accounts describe specific historical individuals who supposedly received this punishment, including King Aela of Northumbria, who was allegedly blood-eagled by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok in revenge for their father's death in a snake pit. Whether these accounts are historically accurate or legendary embellishments, they reveal Viking cultural fascination with torture methods that combined ritualistic significance with extreme cruelty. The public nature of blood eagle executions, as described in the sagas, served important social and political functions within Viking society. These weren't private acts of personal revenge, but public spectacles designed to demonstrate the consequences of opposing Viking authority while providing entertainment for communities that had normalized extreme violence as acceptable social activity. The psychological preparation of blood eagle victims, according to saga accounts, reveals additional disturbing aspects of this practice. Condemned individuals were sometimes informed days or weeks in advance about their approaching fate, during which time they were encouraged to prepare themselves spiritually for an agonizing death that could last for hours while their enemies watched and celebrated. The international reputation of the Blood Eagle contributed to Viking psychological warfare capabilities by creating terror among potential enemies who understood the fate that awaited them if captured. The mere threat of this punishment was reportedly enough to secure the surrender of fortified positions whose defenders preferred quick death in battle to the prolonged agony that awaited them as prisoners. The artistic elements of the Blood Eagle procedure reveal how Viking culture had developed aesthetic appreciation for human suffering when properly presented. The visual effect created by the spread lungs, the careful positioning of the victim to optimize the wing imagery, and the symbolic representation of eagles in flight all suggest conscious attention to creating beautiful displays using human agony as raw material. These 6 traditions reveal a pattern that historians have struggled to acknowledge. Viking society wasn't simply violent in the way that medieval cultures generally were. It was systematically organized around practices that turned human suffering into religious observance, social hierarchy, and cultural entertainment on a scale that exceeded most other civilizations. The thrall system created a foundation of human slavery that went far beyond labor exploitation to include systematic abuse as normalized social practice affecting nearly half the population. The integration of scyther, death, magic into community life required regular access to human sacrifice, victims, and corpse desecration that horrified even medieval observers accustomed to various forms of violence. Blot ceremonies that defined Viking religious life required systematic human sacrifice on scales that exceeded most other medieval cultures, creating annual cycles of terror that shaped entire communities. The funeral practices described by Ibn Fadlan reveal how death itself became an opportunity for demonstrating social hierarchy through the ritualistic abuse and murder of enslaved women. The Blood Eagle torture method represents the ultimate expression of Viking innovation in creating aesthetic spectacles from human agony. What makes these practices particularly disturbing isn't just their individual cruelty, but their complete integration into normal social life. These weren't aberrations or temporary responses to extreme circumstances. They were fundamental aspects of Viking culture that persisted for centuries and influenced every aspect of Norse society, from religious observance to diplomatic relations to child-rearing practices. The archaeological evidence supporting these traditions demonstrates that they weren't simply literary exaggerations or propaganda from Viking enemies. Physical remains, ritual implements, settlement patterns, and burial practices all confirm that these traditions were practiced systematically throughout the Viking world for generations, involving millions of people over 3 centuries. The psychological conditioning required to normalize such practices reveals sophisticated understanding of human behavior that was weaponized to create societies capable of sustaining extreme cruelty over extended periods. Children raised within these traditions developed worldviews that made resistance to systematic abuse virtually unthinkable, while viewing such practices as evidence of cultural superiority. When we romanticize the Vikings today, when we focus on their exploration, their craftsmanship, their complex mythology, we erase the victims whose blood and suffering bought those legends. Every saga hero owned human beings as property. Every beautiful artifact was created by enslaved craftsmen. Every temple was built on foundations of systematic murder. The international reaction to Viking practices, as recorded by contemporary observers from Arabic, Byzantine, Irish, and German sources, demonstrates that even medieval societies, accustomed to various forms of violence, were horrified by the systematic nature of Norse cruelty. These traditions became legendary throughout the medieval world as examples of barbarity that exceeded normal human bounds. Understanding this history provides crucial insights into how systematic cruelty becomes normalized when societies fail to maintain appropriate moral boundaries. The Viking example demonstrates how religious justification, social hierarchy, and cultural tradition can combine to create environments where extreme abuse becomes not just acceptable, but celebrated as evidence of divine favor and cultural strength. If you found this exploration of hidden Viking history as compelling as I did, make sure to subscribe for more content that uncovers the disturbing truths behind historical civilizations that popular culture has sanitized. Comment below to let me know which of these traditions you found most shocking, and what other dark chapters of history you'd like to see explored. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss future videos diving into the shadows of the past where truth is always stranger and more disturbing than fiction.